Chapter 25, Section 3. Military aggression meets a weak response. During the early 1930s, Americans still strongly favored isolationism. With the bitter memory of the First World War and the challenge of economic problems at home, they did not want the nation to become entangled in another war. For this reason, President Franklin Roosevelt took no direct action against aggressive dictators in Asia and Europe. He did, however, speak out against aggression in principle. In his 1933 inaugural address, Roosevelt vowed that the United States would be a good neighbor who respects the rights of others. This pledge was meant to send a message to aggressor nations, but it also reflected his desire to end U.S. intervention in Latin America and improve relations with that region. At a conference later in the year, 21 nations in the Western Hemisphere signed on to Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. They declared no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. Over the next few years, the United States would encourage Japan, Germany, and Italy to abide by this principle. But it would still not back up its words with action. Militarists expand Japan's empire. One of the first examples of blatant aggression came in 1931, when Japan seized a portion of China. Japan and other imperialist powers had previously established spheres of influence in China, where they exploited the country's land and resources. Japan's sphere of influence was Manchuria, a region in northeastern China. When China's nationalist government threatened to expel foreign powers, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria and took control of the region. The takeover of Manchuria had several major consequences. It gave Japan a large piece of territory that was rich in resources. In addition, it began an era in which the military dominated the Japanese government. It also isolated Japan from most other nations. In 1932, the League of Nations ordered Japan to withdraw its army from the region. Japan refused, choosing to withdraw from the League instead. More aggression followed in 1937. In July, the Japanese army clashed with Chinese forces outside Beijing, China's capital. The clash soon became a full-fledged war. The Chinese army pulled back, but the Japanese caught up with them at the city of Nanjing. After capturing the city, Japanese soldiers went on a 6-week rampage known as the Rape of Nanjing. They massacred as many as 300,000 Chinese civilians and brutally raped about 20,000 Chinese women. The war did not stop there. By the end of the year, Japan's military occupied China's main cities and much of its fertile land. Jolted by Japan's aggression, Roosevelt called on peace-loving nations to end the epidemic of world lawlessness. He spoke of the need to quarantine aggressor nations. In international relations, a quarantine is a blockade or boycott. Roosevelt's quarantine speech did nothing to top Japan. By 1941, Japan had added French Indochina to its Asian empire to go along with Formosa, now called Taiwan, Korea, large areas of China, and several small Pacific islands. Europe's dictators test the League of Nations. Japan's aggression tested the League of Nations. The League was intended to serve as an instrument of international law. In theory, it could impose boycotts and other economic sanctions, or use the combined military force of its members to keep unruly nations in line. In practice, however, it was a weak organization, partly because the United States was not a member. The League failed to respond effectively to Japan's challenge. Throughout the 1930s, Germany and Italy would also test the League's will. Like Japan, Germany pulled out of the League of Nations in 1933. At the same time, Hitler began rebuilding the German military. In 1935, he announced the formation of an air force and the start of compulsory military service. Both actions went against the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations lodged a formal protest, but it refused to consider sanctions against Germany. The next year, Hitler openly challenged France by sending troops into the Rhineland. This was another test of the League's resolve to stand up to aggression. Meanwhile, Mussolini began his quest to build a new Roman Empire. In October 1935, the Italian army invaded the African nation of Ethiopia. The poorly equipped Ethiopian forces could not stop the invaders. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations, which voted to impose economic sanctions on the aggressor. The sanctions were mild, and few League members seriously applied them. In May 1936, Italy officially annexed Ethiopia. Hitler heartily approved of the invasion. In October, he and Mussolini joined a treaty of friendship that forged an alliance known as the Rome-Berlin Axis between their countries. Events in Spain also aided the growth of fascism. In July 1936, a military rebellion started the Spanish Civil War. Led by General Francisco Franco, the Spanish military and its right-wing allies known as the Nationalists sought to overthrow Spain's democratic republic. Italy and Germany backed the rebels with supplies, weapons, and troops. Various left-wing groups known as the Republicans battled to save the Republic, with aid from the Soviet Union and volunteer fighters from other countries. Although some 3,000 Americans volunteered, the U.S. government stayed out of the conflict. At least 500,000 people died in the 3-year war. In the end, Franco and the Nationalists won and established a right-wing dictatorship. Great Britain and France seek to appease Hitler. Encouraged by events in Italy and Spain, and by his own successful occupation of the Rhineland, Hitler continued his campaign of expansion. During this time, Britain and France did little to stop him, choosing instead to follow a policy of appeasement. Hitler next set his sights on neighboring Austria, the country of his birth. At the time, Austria had an unstable government with fascist elements. Hitler pressured its leaders to join the Third Reich. Finally, in 1938, a member of the Austrian Nazi Party took over as Chancellor of Austria. On March 12th of that year, Hitler's army crossed the border into Austria without opposition. The following day, he proclaimed Anschluss, or political union, with Austria. Britain and France remained passive spectators to this German expansion. Hitler next wanted to take over Czechoslovakia. By signing the Munich Pact in September 1938, he acquired the Czech region of the Sudetenland. Hitler told Chamberlain that this would be his last territorial demand. Chamberlain chose to believe Hitler, declaring that he had achieved peace with honor, and adding, "I believe it is peace in our time." Another member of Parliament, Winston Churchill, disagreed. He wrote, "By this time next year we shall know whether the policy of appeasement has appeased, or whether it has only stimulated a more ferocious appetite." The U.S. Congress legislates neutrality. During this period, the United States did little to thwart aggression. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, for example, the League of Nations considered establishing an oil embargo, or suspension of trade against Italy. Italy's offensive would grind to a halt without oil. The League asked the United States, a major oil supplier, if it would join the embargo. Roosevelt said no, pointing out that he had just signed the Neutrality Act of 1935. This act prevented the United States from supplying arms, ammunition, or implements of war to nations in conflict. Because the law said nothing about oil, Roosevelt chose not to block oil shipments to Italy. Congress passed additional Neutrality Acts in 1936 and 1937, all designed to keep the country out of conflicts brewing in Europe, such as the Spanish Civil War. Americans passionately supported this isolationism. Like Europeans, they recalled the horrors of World War I and wanted to avoid getting drawn into a new conflict. Roosevelt did, however, devote enormous energy to preserving peace. He wrote letters to the aggressors and to League members urging them to settle their differences through negotiation.